Opening the central diagonal offers immediate development and a bid for space. Unleashing the Sicilian defense, this counterthrust immediately creates asymmetrical pawn structures and fights for central squares with immediate impact. Prepares for kingside castling and opens lines for piece development, a standard approach in this popular opening. Developing the knight to a central outpost fortifies the Sicilian's dynamic pawn structure and readies for swift counterplay. Cracking open the center invites a dynamic struggle for pawn dominance and open lines. Embracing the open Sicilian, Black relinquishes central space for counterplay, initiating a tactical skirmish. Nabbing the central pawn clears the knight to the king's flank, preparing for potential pawn storms. Instantly seeking to fianchetto the bishop, Black embraces a solid Sicilian-Dragon-like structure, though it pre-cooks potential kingside weaknesses for later exploitation. Developing another knight further controls the center and prepares for rapid castling, aiming for a comfortable middle game setup. Developing the bishop to a powerful diagonal prepares to castle and contests central influence. Developing the bishop to a square where it eyeballs the center and supports a potential kingside castling thrust builds harmony, while also subtly discouraging Blacks. In f6, advance by keeping an eye on that crucial e5 square. Developing the knight to its natural outpost here initiates a classic Sicilian counterplay, simultaneously preparing to castle and challenging White's central pawn structure. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure while preparing for castling, this bishop retreat calmly enhances White's developmental harmony, allowing the queen to potentially support a future queenside expansion or reinforce the central pawn chain. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking it away behind a pawn shield is a standard, prudent action, establishing a safe haven before further strategic maneuvers unfold and potential complications arise on the board. Unlocking the kingside pawn chain opens lines for aggressive action, aiming to exploit Black's slightly passive development and potentially pressure the newly exposed king. Stabilizing the center and preparing to challenge the pawn chain with a future e5 push, this move also helps develop the queenside pieces more harmoniously. Shifting the knight to the rim, while potentially weakening its influence on the center, aims to prepare for a queenside expansion or to avoid an immediate central confrontation, perhaps eyeing the d5 square as a future outpost or clearing the way for a pawn push like c4. This maneuver sacrifices immediate central presence for long-term strategic flexibility, a classic trade-off in positions where queenside play is anticipated. Developing the bishop to e6 solidifies the pawn chain, preparing to challenge White's knight on b3 and potentially reroute the bishop to a more active square later on the queenside. It aims to create a more harmonious pawn structure and discourage aggressive kingside play from White, as the dark squares around the Black king are now better protected. Unleashing a kingside pawn storm, White seeks to break open lines and exploit Black's slightly uncoordinated pieces, aiming to create immediate attacking chances before Black can solidify their position and activate their queenside majority. A bold attempt to shatter White's central pawn structure, this pawn thrust immediately challenges White's imposing pawn chain and opens lines for Black's pieces, creating a dynamic, double-edged position where careful calculation will be paramount. Unleashing a pawn storm aims to disrupt Black's harmonious development and seize central space, potentially opening lines toward the castled king. Seizing the initiative by developing the bishop to c8 prepares a potential counterstrike on the queenside, disrupting White's aggressive pawn storm and preventing the f-file from becoming a devastating open highway for White's attacking forces. The pawn capture on d5 immediately resolves the central tension, offering White a clearer pathway to activating the queenside pieces. This frees up the c3 knight, which can now potentially hop to a more dynamic square, and opens the possibility of the queen entering the fray through d2 or e2. Black's position now requires careful maneuvering to untangle the rooks and reintegrate the bishop from c8, which finds itself somewhat awkwardly placed after the exchange. Black initiates a fascinating pawn dance, aiming to disrupt White's centralized knight and potentially open lines towards the queenside, while simultaneously ignoring the central pawn exchange. Seizing the initiative, the bishop repositions to a diagonal that opens attacking lines, pressuring the queen side and preparing to support a future advance on the king side, while simultaneously contesting control over the crucial light squares. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's central grip, black's gambit on the king side, though seemingly impulsive, aims to fracture white's pawn structure and open lines for counterplay, particularly targeting the g-file, which now offers a potential avenue for attacking white's king. This bold decision introduces significant tactical complications, forcing white to carefully consider if the material gain is worth the positional concessions and the increased exposure of their monarch. It's a dynamic shift, moving away from positional maneuvering towards a more aggressive, sacrificial battle. Challenging the misplaced knight on b4, this move not only secures the queen side but also aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for an attack. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice on the king side opens up aggressive lines, but it leaves the black king rather exposed. Consider the immediate repercussions for piece development and controlling the central files. Unblocking the bishop to its natural diagonal, bg2 aims to redeploy the prelate to a more commanding post, surveying the central landscape and potentially reinforcing kingside operations after the recent pawn storm. This reshapes the pawn structure, creating a somewhat unusual but active setup for white where the king remains remarkably safe despite the aggressive advances. Notice how white's pieces are beginning to find harmony, preparing for a more nuanced struggle than pure brute force might suggest. Black's captured pawn on d5, while seemingly a gain, has opened lines and created potential targets for white's well-placed pieces. The game has entered a phase where white is actively developing latent threats, not through immediate checks, but through subtle positional improvements and coordination of forces. Black repositions the knight, shifting focus towards the kingside attack by aiming for the vulnerable g6 square, potentially preparing a regrouping that might exploit white's exposed kingside pawn structure, or even threaten a surprise pawn advance down the h-file later on. Aimed at disrupting black's central control and creating immediate tactical threats against the kingside, this queen maneuver simultaneously supports a potential attack on the d-pawn while preparing to redeploy to a more aggressive square. Unleashing the central pawn majority, black bravely injects dynamic potential into the kingside, aiming to dismantle white's ambitious pawn chain and pry open lines for their own pieces. This injection of initiative, though risky, could lead to a swift counterattack if white isn't careful. Unleashing a kingside assault by committing the monarch to the queen side, this daring maneuver seeks to exploit the open files and potential weaknesses around black's castled king. It's a bold gambit, signaling an immediate intent to destabilize black's pawn structure and create winning chances through aggressive piece play. Black's knight landing on d5 injects a thrilling, if risky, dose of dynamism into the center, directly challenging the opponent's core pawn structure and threatening a series of forceful exchanges. This maneuver is a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt white's established harmony and perhaps open lines for counterplay, but it requires meticulous calculation to avoid falling into tactical traps or creating lasting weaknesses. The knight now sits as a provocative pawn on a square that was recently a point of fierce contention, ready to stir up trouble or become a target depending on white's response. Unleashing a pawn storm with h3, white aims to pry open the kingside and exploit the exposed black monarch, forcing a critical reassessment of black's defensive setup and potentially disrupting the harmony of their pieces. Pushing the pawn to g3 dramatically alters the kingside pawn structure, creating a potential sanctuary for the black king on h7 while simultaneously building a dangerous passed pawn on the kingside. However, it also opens the h-file for white's queen and rook, and creates weaknesses around black's own king if white can exploit them. Black has opted for a very active, almost aggressive pawn advance, daring white to challenge it. This move signals a clear intention to break open lines and create complications, prioritizing offensive potential over immediate defensive solidity. Unleashing the rook to the g-file aims to capitalize on black's weakened kingside pawn structure, creating a potential avenue for attack and contesting the important open file. Unleashing the queen towards the kingside, the defender seeks to disrupt white's burgeoning central control and potentially exploit the raised pawn structure. This aggressive maneuver injects immediate tactical possibilities, aiming to pry open lines that could threaten the white monarch, while also preparing to support a central pawn push or solidify the queenside pawn majority. Initiating this exchange clears the central path, opening diagonals for your pieces and creating potential weaknesses around black's king once the smoke clears. The immediate consequence is a simplified structure, which might favor white's slightly more active pieces, particularly the queenside majority that could develop from this simplified center. Consider the long-term implications for the d-file and the unleashed power of your light-squared bishop if it can find a more active post. The pawn sacrifice has opened a diagonal for the black bishop, potentially disrupting white's kingside slumber. The knight's capture on d5 immediately targets the undefended pawn and exerts pressure on the center, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces. The king retreats to safety, a prudent decision as the center becomes a tactical minefield. Unlocking the queenside dark squares is the immediate objective, allowing the rook on a1 a potential path to participate. A remarkable piece sacrifice is brewing here, aiming to unravel white's kingside structure and expose their monarch. Black's queen glides into a central attacking position, threatening to ignite a firestorm of tactics. The immediate pressure on the e4 pawn and the potential for further piece activation against white's somewhat exposed king suggest black is ready to embrace sharp, unforgiving play, potentially opening lines with a well-timed pawn push. Refocusing the queen back to the d2 square, this maneuver aims to support a potential advance on the kingside and offers a more flexible position for the queen to influence both flanks, while also preparing for a potential regrouping of pieces should the central tension ease. A sudden tactical eruption, sacrificing a bishop to pry open the kingside. Black aims to expose the white king by creating attacking lines with the rook and queen, hoping the pawn storm that white initiated will now backfire. This audacious gambit disrupts white's king's safety and forces an immediate, sharp reevaluation of the board. Initiating a counterattack, the rook's repositioning immediately seizes the open g-file, aiming to disrupt black's king's safety, which has been compromised by the recent pawn advances. The intention is to leverage the initiative gained from black's ambitious, yet potentially overextended, pawn push on the kingside. This aggressive deployment forces black to confront the immediate threats, potentially disrupting their well-coordinated pieces and opening lines for further white aggression. Unleashing the bishop on the h3-c8 diagonal reestablishes immediate pressure on white's king, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure around it and exploit the open g-file. This aggressive thrust is a bold attempt to seize the initiative and disrupt white's well-laid plans for central control and king safety, forcing white to defend diligently. Asserting control over the critical kingside file, this rook maneuver immediately targets black's vulnerable monarch and the precarious pawn structure around it, hinting at a potent mating attack brewing. The rook's repositioning to the open file signals an immediate intention to challenge white's aggressive pawn structure and potentially exploit the exposed king. Stepping back to regroup, white reestablishes a defensive pawn structure and eye the queenside, hinting at a positional squeeze while potentially preparing for further queenside maneuvering rather than an immediate tactical strike. Disrupting white's queenside rook on the h-file opens a critical attacking avenue for black's queen, creating a direct threat against the king and forcing a reactive defense rather than the intended positional maneuvering. Unleashing a potent attacking sequence, queen h2 aims to exploit the weakened kingside, specifically targeting the g3 pawn and the potential discovered attack on the black king should white's pieces coordinate effectively. Unleashing the bishop from its passive post on g4, a subtle shift in the pawn structure now aims to disrupt white's king's safety, seeking to exploit the open g-file and the potentially vulnerable white king castled on the queenside. Unleashing a surprising rook sacrifice, white ignites a fierce storm of complications around black's king, forcing a tactical reckoning and aiming to dismantle the defensive pawn shield with an aggressive queen and rook battery. The king, now exposed on the 7th rank, finds itself in a precarious position, a stark contrast to its earlier safety behind the pawn shield. A forceful check, forcing the black king into a perilous central position, exposing its defenders and creating a decisive attack. The king, now dangerously exposed on the open g-file, desperately seeks refuge, but any attempt to escape deeper into its own territory seems fraught with peril as white's powerful queen and rook maintain their menacing presence. Unleashing the rook onto the open file forces an immediate reaction, aiming to dismantle black's king's surprisingly resilient defense by creating a critical fork of tactical possibilities. A bold gambit of material for initiative, but now the queen is exposed and the king's fortress is severely compromised, inviting a swift mating attack. The immediate consequence of this decisive exchange, forcing the black king into the open, is the inevitable checkmate that will follow. The board is stripped bare, a testament to aggressive exchanges. Now the king faces a stark reality of exposed flanks and a desperate need for defensive repositioning amidst the encroaching enemy cavalry. Unlocking the d-file for the rook, and simultaneously defending the vulnerable c6 square, this maneuver forces a strategic decision for black concerning their scattered pieces. Suddenly, the tension on the central files shifts dramatically. Black desperately attempts to redeploy their rook, aiming to disrupt white's newly established commanding presence on the d-file and open up counterplay, though it leaves the king somewhat exposed to further threats along the now open rank. Suddenly, the endgame feels less about maneuvering and more about the battle for that open d-file. Securing the rook on a more active central file, aiming to exploit the opened lines and challenge white's exposed king. Unleashing the knight to this central outpost creates a powerful threat against black's exposed king, forcing a difficult decision regarding the rook on d7. The rook's re-entry into the fray aims to bolster its protection of the newly acquired open file, a crucial step towards potentially unsettling white's kingly sanctuary and disrupting their attacking setup. The knights are poised to dance into a mating net, threatening to isolate and crush black's king. Unleashing a fierce counterattack, this pawn advance seeks to disrupt white's kingside control and inject some much-needed dynamism into black's position. The aim is to pry open lines towards the beleaguered white monarch, hoping to exploit any lingering weaknesses created by the earlier pawn thrusts and exchanges. It's a bold attempt to seize the initiative, acknowledging the potential danger but prioritizing aggressive counterplay over passive defense. Initiating a decisive attack on the weakened kingside, this maneuver aims to exploit the exposed black king and create immediate mating threats. A desperate gambit to disrupt white's rook control and expose the monarch, aiming to create immediate complications before the inevitable material disadvantage becomes overwhelming. The king's desperate scramble for safety on d2, a direct consequence of the exposed royal position after the pawn advances, now faces immense pressure down the g-file and potential checks from the rook on f1. Opening up the h-file with this pawn thrust creates a double-edged sword, potentially exposing your own king to further threats along that diagonal while simultaneously attempting to disrupt white's defensive structure around their monarch. Consider the implications of white's likely responses. Will they be forced to solidify their king's safety, or will this aggression grant them new attacking opportunities? The king's exposure, now undeniable, is forcibly addressed with a decisive check, aiming to dismantle the defender's desperate attempts at reorganization and exploit the exposed monarch.